Hi friends, Josh from the Narrate team here. This past weekend was the last of our two-part series titled One. Adam spoke to the 5 historical views of politics.
Hey, it's great to see you. So last week we started this conversation and we said, what would it be like to be a part of this community of people where we agreed that there's room for people on both sides of the aisle to pursue and follow Jesus? We started this one conversation. It's a quick one. It's just a two-parter. It's a conversation designed for men. I thought that was good, but apparently it's not, because that's 2 in a row. So we just want to wrestle sincerely with, like, what if there's room for people on both sides of the political aisle to pursue and follow Jesus and to challenge their parties to serve people better? And what if there's room for people who are kind of ambivalent, apolitical towards the whole thing? And what we looked at last week was that you can make the Bible say whatever you want. If you work hard enough, you can make Jesus say whatever you want. And that doesn't make it accurate, but you can certainly do that. You can proof text things to death if you want. But the one thing you can't do is, in dealing with the question, what did Jesus say is of utmost importance, supreme importance, what's most important, you can't really manipulate that because he spoke to it definitively. I mean, he was asked one day, so what's the most important thing? Not what are all the important things, not is there only one important thing, what's the most important? And he spoke very clearly. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. There was no breath in between. He had his caffeine. It was just one thing, though it looks like 2 to us. And so what we started exploring last week, and man, I wish I was smart enough to come up with this stuff, but I'm just smart enough to steal it from people who do. But we adapted this statement that Andy Stanley said, where we just said, what if, go ahead to that next slide, what if we can disagree on what's best for people, but we dare not disagree that what's best for people is best? In other words, what would happen if within our political conversations and our ideological conversations and our workplace conversations about those types of things and our dinner conversations about those types of things, what if we could establish, like, wait a minute, are we talking about what's best for people? Okay, so we agree on that. Okay, so what we're doing is we're seeing the problem addressed in 2 unique ways. And that doesn't mean, like, what if there's not a wrong way? It's not to suggest that at all. It's not to say that there aren't some ideas that are good and some that are bad and some that are healthy and some that are toxic. But what if we just agreed that we can disagree on what's best for people, but we dare not disagree that what's best for people is what's best? And we finished up last week by saying, and what if we became students, not critics of people? And what if we leaned forward and took the time to understand, how did you get there? Have you always felt that way? Why do you feel that way? And again, not in the end so that you just kind of agree, or not even in the end so that you come to the conclusion that your disagreements are completely trivial, but just so that you begin to understand and appreciate, like, wait a minute, we're coming at this from different angles for very specific reasons. So this week, I kind of feel like I should be emulating one of my favorite profs, Dr. Bruner, who we talked about last week. I feel like I should have my bow tie on. Did you know that people who go to Oxford always, they like to wear Oxford socks? He would have his Oxford socks on. I'm not qualified. But I feel like I should have a cup of coffee and a laser pointer in my hand, because what I want to do this morning, and when I first bumped into this, I was like, wow, I've got to figure out how to steal a good significant portion of this because it was so helpful for me. What I want to do is look at these 5 historic perspectives that sincere followers of Jesus have adopted as it relates to what is the relationship between my faith and my understanding of government. What is the relationship between Jesus and politics? And so what we're going to do is look at this kind of broad spectrum, kind of lecture style, and then I want to begin to ask some questions about how that might land, but they really amount to this. What would happen if we began to recognize that we didn't come to our view purely because we thought it through? That's not to say you haven't thought about it. But what if we made allowance for the fact that there are other things that contribute to our view other than our intellect and our keen ability to think through things? What if there's more to it than that? Now, these 5 views would be on a spectrum, and like all spectrums, you would have extreme ends of either, and then you'd have a few things bunched in the middle. And on one far side, the far right side, now here's one of the tricks. Please don't read into right or left, because here's the good news. My right is your left. So don't read into that, okay? But on one far extreme side is what you would call the Anabaptist view. Now, the Anabaptist view, to understand it, you have to begin to appreciate that in the first 10 years of the historical expression of this movement, the vast majority of their leaders were killed violently by Christian governments. So you kind of have to consider that as you move forward. And to understand this movement, you have to begin to understand something called the Radical Reformation. Now, probably most of you have heard of the Reformation. There was a guy who led the Civil Rights Movement who sent a text message to the Pope. Also a bad joke. There was a guy named Martin Luther who sent a text message to the Pope going, hey, I've got a problem with these 99 things that we've got going on within our diocese. And the response wasn't very good. It created a bit of a rift. Well, what the Anabaptists said was that the Reformation was good. What the Radical Reformation says is the Reformation was good, but it didn't go far enough. Because, see, the Reformation left intact an agreed-upon relationship between church and state. The Reformation said, like, wait a minute, we should probably still collect taxes, we should still pick up the garbage, we should still raise an army, and this became especially important for the Lutheran movement, which we'll talk about in a second, because remember, Luther instantly was leading a movement that had set itself up against the Catholic Church, and that war, I think, is largely over, so please don't read anything into any of these comments in that regard. But nonetheless, what you had was the Lutheran Church giving resistance to another view that very much had their own army and their own government. And so the Lutheran view wanted to continue to draft guys into the army. They wanted to continue to have soldiers. And the Anabaptist view came along and said, wait a minute, that was a good start, but you didn't go far enough. And they became into complete separation. It started very antagonistic. Today, it gives expression in much more passive ways. And by these guys, today we would be thinking of Quakers and Mennonites, anytime you hear brethren within someone's expression of faith. But to be sure, in very real ways, this is a part of a lot of evangelical expression of faith. Now, another way to think about these guys is you've probably used this phrase yourself on occasion, the lesser of two evils. In fact, one of my professors said to me recently, Adam, this is going to be the first election in my lifetime that it's going to be decided upon not who do I like the most, but who do I hate the least. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but it ties into the lesser of two evils idea. And what the Anabaptists said was if you choose the lesser of two evils, you're still choosing evil. And they would say, we still have another option. Choose nothing. Choose no one. They are conscientious objectors. If you're watching football today, you'll probably see that advertisement for that movie that all my kids want to see, and I don't know if they should see it, but about this soldier in World War II who wouldn't pick up a gun and saved all these guys. And I'm assuming, I should have taken the time to look it up, but I didn't. I'm assuming there's some Anabaptist roots to that man's expression of life and of faith because they just wanted nothing to do with it. And part of the reason why was in places like Matthew 5, Jesus said some pretty straightforward things. He said, you've heard that it was said, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. Continuing in verse 43, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the good and the evil and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. These guys would say, and the Anabaptist, this view would say, it's pretty hard to love your enemy when you're pointing a gun at them. And so they just completely disconnect. Now, another thing to understand about the Anabaptist view is their skin crawls with Christian nationalism. Like the suggestion that we can intermingle faith and government for an Anabaptist, because see, here's what they observe in the text. They see Israel way back in the time of, in the Old Testament, they see Israel asking God for a king, and God gave them a king named Saul, but what they observe is that God gave them Saul reluctantly. That it was a concession, it wasn't his idea, and it didn't turn out very good. And so it's not so much that they're against people in government, they're against the very idea of Christians intermingling their faith with government. Another very important doctrine within these guys' teaching, and this was at the very core of the foundation of this historical movement, is something called the Schleichheim Confession. You kind of have to spit out the side of your mouth when you say it, kind of like Julio Jones. One of my sons has Julio Jones on his fantasy football team, and he was always calling him Julio. And it's like, it's not Julio Jones. He's like, I know, but it's so weird to say Julio. The Schleichheim Confession, at its very foundation and its initial promptings, says things like, we, the church, are not battling against flesh and blood, but against the strongholds of Satan within our unseen realm. Ephesians 6:12 would be a very important approach in these guys' perspective. They would say things where it says this, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So in summary, the Anabaptist view would go complete separation. There's no place for intermingling and working together on this issue. Now, one step to the left would be the Lutheran view, or what Luther himself called the two kingdoms view. Go ahead to that next slide, yeah. The two kingdoms view, and what Luther observed, and by the way, as I talk more about this one, I suspect what you'll see is this one is very prevalent within the psyche of our country. Our founding fathers may have not all identified themselves as Lutheran, but they had a very Lutheran understanding because they had their own schism going on with the Church of England. See, the Lutheran view says this, that there are two domains in the world. There's the spiritual and there's the physical. And what they said was, you need both because you need government to control the sinful behavior of fallen people on the planet. And so what they would say is that government is a necessary accommodation. That it may not be the ideal, but it's absolutely what we have going on, again, because of this idea of sacred and secular. They would say there's two realms. There's the sacred, spiritual, immaterial. This is the realm of belief. And then there's the physical, the secular, the realm of behavior. And their view, go ahead to that next slide, was that government exists to provide security and to promote human flourishing. But government has no place in the role of belief. See, Lutheran was provoking the Catholic Church when he was saying this because he had this strong distinction between behavior and belief. And the way he was provoking Catholicism was he's going, wait a minute. The government has no place in telling people what they can or can't believe. Remember, at this time, the Catholic Church was forcing people to convert by way of the threat of death, and they had to give expression to it through baptism. And Lutheran went like, no. The government's out of its lane. The government's lane is to create laws and enforce codes that get broken, fallen people to behave and to enact punishment when they don't so that it's secure and safe for all. And the church's job, and only the church's job, Luther would say, is to preach the gospel. Nobody else can do that. They would look at places like Mark 12. Go ahead to that, would you please? Where it just said, then Jesus said to them, he's speaking to the disciples, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. So where the Anabaptist view sees no place for government, and there's expression of that today. Some of these guys, some Anabaptists just don't even vote. Others are just kind of apart from the whole culture as a whole. The Lutheran view would go, no, there's a place. But the key is they got to stay in their own lanes. Now, one of the main Lutheran theologians of the last 100 years is a guy named Hermann Sauce. He invented mustard. Go ahead to that next slide. He said this, there can be no Christian state. So you can see, this is a direct affront against other views. There's as little possibility of a Christian state as there is a possibility of Christian technology. Now, another way to say this is what they would say, and you'll hear proponents of this view say, is that if you can't baptize it, it can't be Christian. So they would say you can't have a Christian school, you can't have a Christian band, you can have people who are trying to give expression of those values, but you can only have Christian people. So there's the Anabaptist, separation, next slide, and then there's Lutheran, government's here, and it's a necessary accommodation. And then there's this middle view, and I put this in the middle not because it represents the ideal balance point, but because it's so distinct from the other two. And it's the one that was most exciting for me to research because I knew so little about it. But it's what you'd call the historic black church view, or the prophetic view. Now, to be clear on a couple things, not that political correctness is important on these matters, just kidding. Everybody who's a part of the historic black church view is not an African American, nor is every African American who follows Jesus a part of the historic black church view. Let's just be clear on that. This view could also be called the Central and South American view, because so much of the liberation theology that's come up out of that hemisphere of the world is very closely related. But to understand this view, you've got to begin to appreciate the prophets and the way they spoke to Israel in their day. Now, there's a prophet named Amos. He's a minor prophet, which means he was very small in stature. He said this, this is Amos speaking to Israelites. Listen to what he says. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will accept them. I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. This is a guy calling out Israel and its temple. And what this prophetic view understands and sees is that God's chief concern is that justice is promoted by his people. that they have to stand up against systemic injustice. Listen to the way Amos continues. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. I'm not asking you to agree with this view so much as to understand the historic black church view, is to understand that what they were deeply passionate about was a people who were committed to justice. And one way to illustrate it would be to talk about a guy named Reverend Wright. Some of you may remember 8 years ago when then candidate Obama was, or now President Obama was candidate Obama. And there was a big uproar. And whatever news station you watch was talking about it. Only the one though, right? Just kidding. Because Reverend Wright was quoted as having said, "God damn America." And there was an uproar about how could a president, how could a patriot support a pastor and be a part of a church that said this? Well, you might not agree with it, but historically, to understand it in context is to know that Reverend Wright was not saying anything that's not said in historic black churches and has been for a very long time, because their passion is that God cannot associate himself with someone who continues to perpetrate injustice, and thus his message was, if we don't deal with that, then God is going to have to smite us. You could say it this way. Next slide. The role of the church in this view is to draw Christians and the country toward the vision of God for the flourishing of all mankind. Another way to talk about this is to talk about the civil rights movement. Now, what historians will tell us is that many of our eyes aren't trained to see that the majority of the leaders in photos like this one were Christ-following clergy, that this movement was really led by Christ followers. And really, the rhetoric, the message, they were just secularized versions of sermons that have been being preached for generations in their churches. This movement is so founded upon the shoulders of American slavery, of Jim Crow laws, of segregation, of all of that. Martin Luther King Jr., in his famous I Had a Dream speech, he had no intentions of giving that part of that speech on the Washington Mall. You can hear, if you listen to the recording, someone in the background going, "Tell him, Martin, tell him about your dream, Martin." That was actually an adaptation of a sermon he had given in Detroit 3 weeks previous to that day. So it's all very tied together. It's why today when you see an injustice in a place like Atlanta or a large urban center and it involves an African-American minority, the people standing with the victims will be the clergy. And for us, we have problems, perhaps, with the way they give expression, even through their wealth and opulence. But for these guys, the whole thing is about bringing justice. Now, in my research, I listened to an interview of a Christ-following African-American man, and he was asked this question. So what, and in case we haven't been controversial enough, go ahead to that next slide. They just asked this question. So what does the prophetic movement do with this statement, "Make America Great Again"? And again, we can always risk generalizing, but this view would say, well, in order to accomplish that, we've got to identify a place behind us that makes the argument that it was superior to anything we could have over here. And you can see how, in this view, they would go, "Make it great again," like that's oxymoronic to us. Or you could ask it this way, and I thought this, man, I love it when I find good things to plagiarize. This, to me, was such an important question. You could write a thesis on this question. You could ask this question: is Christianity, go ahead to the next slide, is Christianity nostalgically or optimistically oriented? Like, is the central thrust of the Bible maintaining and preserving something we used to have, taking us back to a place we used to be? And sometimes you'll hear people say, like, I want an Acts 2 expression of church. That's a nostalgic, like, I want to go back. Or is it optimistic? In other words, the full glory of God is coming, and the best is still yet to come. You could ask this question: why is it, and again, risking generalization, but why is it that African Americans tend to vote Democrat? Go to that next slide. And as I was researching this, I thought this guy was just so fair. You might not agree, I might not agree, whatever, but he said, well, we got to define terms. What is, he said, a conservative by definition? Again, it's an attempt to preserve something. And the question becomes, well, then what would these minorities, what would they want to preserve? And what is progressivism by definition? It's facing forward. So there's a whole view of doing church that goes, wait a minute, our job is to deal with injustice and make it better than it was before. Now, one step to the left of that, just because I could see your blood temperature, your blood pressure rising, is what we might call the reformed or the transformationalist view or the transformational view. Now, this view goes way back as well, but John Stott in the 1970s captured it very well when he observed, go ahead to that next slide, John Stott, this great Scottish thinker, that creation is framed by the theme of, or the Bible is framed by the theme of creation, fall, redemption. That God started something, it was beautiful, it was heading in a great direction. People sullied it by their disobedience or by what others would say their failure to listen, and that God is in the process of redeeming it. Ultimately, through Christ, he's accomplished that. And here's the catch, here's the unique part of this reformed view, is that they would say it's our job, our opportunity to be a part of that redemption now. They are very focused on engage versus withdraw. Because, right, you can see the Anabaptists are just like, to hell with all of it. We're just going to follow Jesus and have this community. And the Lutherans are more apt, this view is more apt to go like, we're going to have to figure out how do we keep the two in their separate lanes. This view goes, no. We need Christ followers in all the lanes, influencing culture in that way. We need to stop withdrawing and start engaging it. One of their main thinkers, and anytime you hear someone quote this guy, you know you're talking to a very sincere Reformed person, is a guy named Abraham Kuyper. He was Dutch. Dutch Reform is so at the core of all of this. And listen to what he said. He said, there's not 1 square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ does not cry, mine. So they were going, we're not withdrawn. We're not going anywhere. We're redeeming. And they would look to places like Colossians 1. In Colossians 1, in this, I think, ever important text, especially for them, it says this, for in him, speaking of Jesus, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. And for them, government is not an accommodation, it's not a necessary concession, it's a vital part of the created order, and God wants to restore it. Now, within these next two, both this view and the one next step over, they're both very, very susceptible to something called dominionism. And susceptible makes it sound like a disease, and maybe that's not fair. Both views can, in my view, the Reformed view, how's that for terrible prose? The Reformed view has a very clear distinction, and maybe they all do, and I'm more clear on this one because it's a little bit closer to me, I don't know. But there's the dominionist view. And this view, you know you're hearing it when people say things like, it takes reformed people to reform culture. The dominionist view would say, we're not just here to restore creation. We're not just here to be a part of it. We need Christians in charge, and we need the laws to reflect Christian values. The dominionist view, and you could criticize it by saying, that how is that any different than what's happening in our world with ISIS right now? It's a very fair conversation. They would say the laws need to reflect Christian values. We need to, in distinction from the Lutheran view, we need to legislate Christian morality. And there's another side of this Reformed view that would be much more comfortable going, no, God is in the process of redemption. He even lets Christ followers participate on occasion, but his grace is very general, and it has an ability to supersede these I believe, I don't believe guidelines. Clear as mud? One view to the left of that is what we would call Catholicism, or the Catholic view. Now, I want to be very clear here. I have some dear friends who are Catholic. I myself was raised Catholic. I don't mean this in any kind of passive criticism. And in fact, one of the funny things about this view from my perspective is when you look at it academically, probably many of the Catholics that you know, or maybe that you are more Lutheran in their view than they are Catholic. In fact, I grew up in an eastern Montana Catholic town, and I can now see, that's ironic. It was an eastern Montana Lutheran Catholic town because our view was much more Lutheran. Because the Catholic view, in its truest definition, is most comfortable with a syncretism between church and government. They see no problem with kings being presidents and vice versa. They're very much into, wait a minute, we can do this together in its purest form. It's why we have things like a pope, they represent this. And yet the distinction of even this pope versus the one before it also represents that there's a lot of diversity within this view. They have what they call their 7 social doctrines, and I'm not going to get into them for fear of boring you to more sleep than you are already. but they're actually pretty fascinating. But these 7 doctrines actually guide the relationship between church and government and dictate when there's an intersection or a contradiction, why church gets the trump card, why they get to make the decision. But here's my question. What if you didn't arrive at your view because you're so darn smart? Like, not to say that you're not smart. Don't let me accuse you of that. But what if your view is a part of your problem solving? It's a part of your keen intellect. It's a part of the fact that you thought this thing through so much. But what if that's an oversimplification? What if part of your view, you've arrived at it emotionally, contextually, geographically, socioeconomically? You know, I was walking home on Wednesday, and I was so excited about the academic part of this, and then I remembered that one of my mantras is interesting information isn't enough, like that doesn't matter. I was like, okay, so how in the world, how does this thing land in real life? And I was somewhere near the man store as I was walking home in this, I'm so judgmental, so just hear me out, don't leave before I finish. This like brand new car went flying by me, and I thought to myself, because I don't emphasize a lot of things to my boys, but there's 2 things that I'm constantly trying to emphasize, and it's simply this, like, if you just be careful who you have sex with and how you spend your money, you'll be a long ways forward in life. Add God to that, and you got like the great trifecta, like you'll be in great shape. But I'm constantly kind of harping on them about like cars and car payments. And again, I know some of you have brand new cars, and I'm not judging you, don't just hear me out here, but they're just constantly saying, like, guys, don't get a car payment. You live in Helena, get a high-mileage car. Like, you can walk if it breaks down. It's not that big a deal. There's some really nice 100,000-mile cars. Like, don't have a car payment. And this car went flying by me. And in that moment, I remembered my grandpa Bill, who I spent incredible amounts of time with and really had deep admiration for. One of the things he used to always, I've never thought of this before, one of the things he used to always say to me is, someday, Adam, my dream is someday I want to drive a car that was made in the same decade that I'm living. And that was like one of his deals. And in that moment, it hit me, and I went like, wait a minute. Maybe the way I harp on my boys about their car and future car, maybe it's not just because I'm such a genius when it comes to personal finances. I mean, I think I am, but maybe that's not all of it. Maybe I've emotionally arrived there because there's some things in my context. Listen, what if your view is, it's not to say that there aren't some aspects of it that are true. It's not to say that all views are true. I'm trying to argue for the both and of what if we could just begin to acknowledge, like, wait a minute, I got here somewhat emotionally. Or there's this one, like, it just occurred to me this week that in some of your minds, the Broncos aren't the best organization in professional sports. I mean, I'm a Bronco fan because I think they're the best, not because I'm like, I want to be a Bronco fan. And I could argue for it because, you know what? In the last 34 years, there's only one organization in professional sports, any sport that has a higher winning percentage than the Broncos, and that's the San Antonio Spurs. So we could make some mathematical arguments. Right, Eric? But you know what else I did with my grandpa every Sunday morning? Watch the Broncos. And you know where I grew up? Billings, Montana, 550 miles from Denver. Guess what's on the TV every Sunday? Whether Kyle Orton's the quarterback or not. The Denver Broncos. I moved to Helena. I was like, wait a minute, where's the Bronco game? Then someone was like, they're 2-12, and Tim Tebow's their quarterback. What do you mean, where's the Bronco game? There's a better game on. I'm like, that would never happen in Billings. It's the only game that you get to watch. What if it's not so clear? And what if, therefore, the opportunity to lean forward and go, wait a minute, how did you get there? And I might not agree with you, but maybe this will deepen my own understanding of faith. In Matthew 10, Jesus, I don't know whether it's his favorite list, we don't entirely know how he got here, but he lists off the 10 apostles, and listen to this. These are the names of the 12 apostles. I said 10, the 12. It's Matthew chapter 10. First Simon and his brother Andrew, James son of Zebedee and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, the first 4, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they were in a sailboat. They're from a place called Bethesda. I've been there. Last time I got to go to Israel, I went there. It's a few miles off the shore. Some people think an earthquake may have shifted it, and it used to be on the shore of the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. And at best, archaeologists think it was a community of about 200 people, which would mean that 4 of the most influential people in human history, if this is all true, came from Winston. Just saying. Like, they came from Two Dot, if you're from eastern Montana. I mean, they came from this little tiny town, and they probably all voted Republican. I don't know. But, right, like, and they all had these maybe it was all Democrat, but the point is there was this very homogenous community. And they were probably terrified of city folk and educated folk. But the story continues, because you know who else is a part of that crew? Is Matthew the tax collector. Now, what does that tell us about Matthew? Well, the fact that he's a tax collector probably means that his parents voted Rome. They lived in a country that was deeply suspicious of Rome, and this guy's a follower of Jesus, and he was, at the very least, raised in a family that supported what some would say were the enemy. That he's a tax collector probably means he was affluent. These guys came from Winston. He came from a palace. He had lots of money. He probably rode a really nice donkey. He probably traded it in every 3 years. And the story continues. Simon the Zealot. You know what a zealot was? There's really no... I'm sorry if this is offensive, but it was ISIS. Zealots were people who had religiously aligned themselves with the conviction that the very best thing you could do to Rome was kill it. I've been in their hometown. It's chilling. They pridefully carried daggers with them. Because for them, the win, we might say that it's engaging people who are disengaged by Jesus and baptizing people who suddenly follow him. The win for them was co-opting the government by sinking the dagger into some Roman dignitary's chest in the middle of the market. They carried daggers around. They liked to find large crowds. They liked to sneak up next to people in these large crowds and anonymously kill them. IEDs. That was their game. One of them followed Jesus. In fact, he made the cut of the final 12. Another guy's name was Judas Iscariot, and his is unique. Scholars debate what is the Iscariot piece. It seems most clear that it's geographical in nature. And if that's true, then that means that Judas came from Jerusalem, which would mean, he went to Yale, and then there's these 4 fishermen that don't even know what school is. It means that, he probably had uncles who were a part of the spies that were coming to check Jesus out. It means that he was an integral part of Jerusalem. And they all followed Jesus. What if that diversity actually makes the whole thing work better? You don't even necessarily find Jesus taking them aside and individually rebuking them for their ideology, but you do find them coexisting. What if the homogeneous thing is not the goal? Because it doesn't reflect the nature and being of God. And that doesn't mean that there isn't room for ideological debate and conversation and disagreement, but that we don't confuse that for what really matters. My all-time favorite thinker is a guy named Dallas Willard. Near the end of his life, he made the statement, he said, "You've got to understand that I think when I get into the other side of the veil, I'll have gotten far more wrong than I got right." How about you? I want a Jesus that I can intellectually figure out. Don't you? I study and I teach this stuff and I learn about it and I preach on it and I talk about it. You know what the trouble is? I can't do it. Can you? I can't live out my own ideology, can you? It's impossible. Which is what brings me back to the cross and the resurrection and grace. Not a cheap kind that hasn't thought through the hard things. The earned kind that knows well the difficulty and concludes at the end of the day, listen, it's not my ballot that makes me right with God. In fact, it has very little to do with me. It's him. His astounding grace that makes this thing come together. What if to be the church is to make allowance for all of that? to know full well you're never going to live out your own ideology. And if you have to, you're toast. But there is a God whose grace surpasses it, and we ought not try to capture it in a bottle because we'll leave too much of it out. Jesus, thanks that your grace is bigger. Thanks, Lord, that you invite us to do this seemingly contradictory thing of being deeply engaged in our culture, and that our own context and background and family of origin and occupation and vocation and geography, that all that thing, it sways us to have strong opinions and beliefs. Jesus, would you keep us grounded in grace? Not a cheap kind that just is willy-nilly, but a kind that understands that forgiveness is expensive. That grace isn't an avoidance of all the issues. It's a clear understanding of just how complicated it all is. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.